Have you noticed this animation in the World Cup broadcasts? It's everywhere, and I couldn't stop thinking, could I, arguably still a beginner at motion design, recreate it in Cavalry? Let's find out. So, what's the plan? Well, first I had to create a rectangle shape, then add some text, animate the shape, and then, okay, I'm just going to show you. So, starting off with this rectangle, I started off by widening it to around 800 just to have the general shape down, and then change the corner radius to 45. And then to have something nicer to look at, I changed the color. And now we have the first complete. Now, before animating this, I thought it would be a good idea to just add the text shape and set the proper settings for this animation so that we had the general layers added to the scene, and that was just by adding these settings to the text. And that was that task complete, and we can now actually disable the visibility of the text shape since we want to focus on the rectangle shape. Now, looking at this timeline, I thought a end length of 40 for this animation would be good, so I added some keyframes to make it go from 0 to 800, and then a frame rate of 30, but you can also set it to 60 FPS if you want that. Now, apart from the fact that it looks very boring right now, there's a problem that it goes from 0 to 800, which you can go around this problem, but it's generally better to have something go from 0 to 100. That's why I deleted that animation and went ahead and added a value layer. In here, we can set the maximum value, which in this case was going to be 800. And then using the strength here, we can make it go from 800 to 0, changing the percentage. So right now it would output 0, and then right now it would output 800. And then we can just drag that value into the rectangle shape's width. And now it's just a little more intuitive, and we can easily change the value to change the whole width of the rectangle. And then I could just animate the percentage here from 0 to 100, the same way we did before, and we have the exact same animation, but we can easily change the value now. I'll show you later in the video how this comes in handy, but for now I went ahead and added some easing to the animation by changing the key interpolation to Bezier and then just adjusting them until I had something I liked. And this takes a few trial and errors, but at the end I found something that looked pretty good and worked as a sort of pop-up animation, and we could now cross that off the checklist. Now, at this point, I realized there was a bit of a problem between the width of the text versus the width of the rectangle shape. They were not matching, and I wanted to build a system that automatically matched the text shape width. And thankfully, there was a layer called measure text, which was perfect for this use case. So I selected both the text shape and the measure text, and then I just dragged in the string to the string and the font to the font, and finally the font size to the font size of the measure text. And now we could see here from this out text size, we can see we actually have the precise width of the text. So I could drag that into the value, and now it matched perfectly, no matter what we call it. I don't know, maybe you could call this a ripple animation, and it will just perfectly match. However, I did decide to add a expression of plus 80 to make it so that there's a little bit of margin on the sides. And that was that task complete. Now, the next thing I had to do was the essential part of this animation, which was this staggered ripple effect. So I disabled the visibility of the text, and then with the rectangle shape selected, I added a duplicator. This duplicates this shape, but I wanted them to be in one point and not a grid, so selected point distribution and then selected a count of 5. Right now, you couldn't really see anything, and I wanted to change the color of the duplicates, so I added something called a color array. And since there were 5 shapes, I needed 5 different colors, which I set like this. And after that, I tested the animation to see no change, and what is the problem here? I tried changing the distribution, and I couldn't see them behind either, and I discovered that I forgot to just connect it to the rectangle shape. Yeah, but after I fixed that little issue, I now saw that the colors were working, and we could check that off the list. With that done, I reverted back to the normal distribution of point, And I could see they were all just stacked and not staggered like in the original. So to do that, I knew that in the duplicator, you have this thing called the shape time offset. Now changing it just like in here, you can see that it offsets all duplicates. And of course, I didn't want that. I wanted to add a behavior called stagger, which does it individually for each cube or rectangle. Now I set a maximum value of -10 and I saw no change at all. I couldn't see them, but once I hovered over the duplicator, I could see that something was working. You could see the staggering going on, but I couldn't see the colors. So I went ahead and tried a lot of different things like adding a 3D matrix and rotating, and honestly I didn't really know what I was doing. But I finally figured out that going into the stagger, there's this thing called a graph. And all I had to do was to go into this graph and hit flip. Literally, that was what I had to do. And now the colors were working. They weren't perfect yet, but that was fixed by adding some different curves. And yeah, it was pretty satisfying to see this work. And I could now finally get one step closer to finishing this animation. And I could now cross off that stagger duplicates. And now I could finally move on to the text by re-enabling it and seeing that, well, it wasn't working yet and I wanted to mask it somehow. Now, going into the text shape, I did try to just go into the masks here and just drag in the original rectangle with this third mode of the masking enabled. And I could see that some masking was going on, but it was only the outermost rectangle shape it was masking from. And this wasn't what I wanted. So I decided to try the duplicator, and of course I had to re-enable the duplicator's visibility since it was working as a mask, but it still wasn't masking to this center black rectangle. But when I tried to search for submesh inside of the add menu, I discovered something called extract submeshes, which I hadn't really used before. Now adding it, I went into it and saw that you could input a duplicator, which I then did, and you could actually index the last duplicate, which in this case was the center one. So now you could see I'd actually targeted this inner rectangle, so I could actually go into the Cavalry text here and then drag the extract submeshes into the clipping masks, and finally was behaving like I wanted to, and I could now finally cross that mask text off the checklist. And now for a finishing touch, I thought that the text was a bit static. When I played the animation, you could see that the text was just standing still, and I wanted a bit of movement to it. Now I thought, well, we could maybe play with the character spacing here and maybe connect that to the value strength so we keep this sort of procedural system we have. So I decided to drag this strength value over to the character spacing, and that would obviously result in a character spacing of 0 to 100. So I added a expression to this character spacing. And when working with expressions, you can either just play around with the values to try and figure out what needs to be inputted to get the right output. Or in this case, I think I might have actually asked AI to give me the expression. And I think that's one of the good use cases for AI in the creative field without sort of ruining it. And I think I ended up with a 0.15 minus 15, which gives this nice change in the character spacing. And now that the system was done, we could input whatever text we wanted and it would just give the animation like so. Now, if you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe and hit the like button. And if you would like to support me even more, you can buy me a coffee in the link below. Thanks for watching.